Hey guys, what's going on? Welcome to the first book review video of the year. I'm changing up my reading goals slightly. It's no longer going to be book-based, it's going to be word-based, which is essentially the same thing. It just doesn't punish me for trying to read longer books. And the number 4 million may seem impressive and look good on a YouTube thumbnail, but it's just the equivalent average of about 50 books. So at the end of each of these videos, I'm going to add up how many words I read and hopefully figure out how to animate one of those fundraiser thermometer graphs, track it throughout the year, and hopefully get there. We'll see. Anyways, first book I got for you is Breakfast at Tiffany's by Truman Capote. I read In Cold Blood last year. I called it a masterpiece. I think I snubbed it a little bit in the end of year rankings. The book had a really noble aim, and I think that's true for Breakfast at Tiffany's as well. He starts off detailing this character. She's a gold digger, she's vain, she's vapid, and you're not supposed to like her. She's not killing anybody in cold blood, but she's still preying upon people. And it's seen through the eyes of this first-person main character who is her neighbor, who is very obviously Truman Capote, who likes her as well. She doesn't have the ability to manipulate Truman Capote as much as these other men because of his sexual preference, but she still has a power over him. But as the story progresses, you start to sympathize with her. You start to learn why she is this way and why she deserves sympathy just like everybody else. Again, it's less of an uphill battle than In Cold Blood, where you see these people murder this completely innocent family. But still, there's animosity there, and it is dispelled by the end of the book, which is, like I said, a very noble cause. Frederick Bachman does it in A Man Called Ove, and Britt Marie was here. If Bachman, or better yet, if Capote could write a book featuring every kind of flawed personality type out there, then I think we could achieve world peace. I don't think that's unreasonable, although Capote is dead, unfortunately. But Breakfast at Tiffany's was a short story. I think it was a novella, so there were other works in here. And Capote has this magical writing style where no matter what he's talking about, I'm into it. Neil Gaiman's like that, Stephen King's like that to an extent. And trying to write a book myself, I was trying to study what exactly it is. With Capote, it's the dialogue. He's mastered that. But there's some other short stories in here. There's House of Flowers, which is a love story that blossoms at a cockfight, so that was kind of a hurdle I had to get over. But by the end, it was beautiful, and it was a message about laying your cards on the table. It's a message about playing the game and not waiting for the right time to strike, because you could wait forever. There's never an ideal time, so just get in there. I think that's a message that's even more relevant today. Another story, A Diamond Guitar, which was definitely the runt of the litter, but it's a prison break story, and I'm kind of a sucker for those. And lastly, A Christmas Memory, which I was a little late in reading, but it's this beautifully touching story about the relationship between a grandmother and a grandson. And I'll be honest, I got kind of misty-eyed at the end of it, which isn't really anything of note by itself, but this was a short story. This was like 10 pages or less, so for him to accomplish that was pretty masterful. I do have to say this was not as good as In Cold Blood. I'm probably going to give it the same rating, but In Cold Blood, definitely Capote's masterpiece. This one, great as well. Next up, we got A Farewell to Arms by Ernest Hemingway. If you watched my last video, it's probably no surprise that I picked this book, although ultimately I regret it. It's the story of an ambulance driver in World War I, which Ernest Hemingway was, so autobiographical to an extent, I imagine. It's a love story between him and the nurse who cares for him after he is wounded in action. And that has to be my first qualm with it, was that I didn't believe the love story. Very similar to How to Stop the Time War, and I'm sure that's the first time those two books have been compared, but I didn't believe the love story. So I DNF'd that book very early on because I knew I wasn't gonna have a good time. This one, however, I soldiered through, no pun intended. And I didn't believe the love story because the woman that Hemingway writes here, it's kind of like he fell in love with an AI pleasure bot. He writes a woman whose main desire is to be what the man wants. And maybe that was more common back then. And it made me realize that all romances in books are essentially the writer falling in love with themselves because they're writing both characters. And that kind of threw me for a loop. Hemingway, you know, being their stereotypical masculine figure, writing the most submissive woman, probably the biggest doormat of a character that I've ever read in any book. But you know what? Eventually, I got over it because it's wartime. Luckily, I don't have much context about how that feels, but the baby boomers exist for a reason, so tensions were high. Love was formed between these two characters. It does finally start to pick up around page 200 or so, and I'm engaged, and I'm rooting for these characters. Everyone talks about Hemingway's writing style. I thought it was very easy to slip into the flow of. It's basic, it's simple, and it does get a little old. But, you know, reading this book in the first place is kind of a chore. That's a bit too harsh of a word. So, you know, I was prepared to do that. But he does hit you with some wisdom finally at the end of this book. I'm going to paraphrase here, but this was the quote that's going to stick with me. He says, "The world breaks everyone, and those it can't break, it kills." Which is very true, which is a message I need to hear, probably a message a lot of people need to hear, especially those who subscribe to Hemingway's modern day Andrew Tate kind of masculinity, where, you know, you got your barrel chest to the ocean and you're just taking wave after wave, just smack it against you, and the salt's getting in your eyes, and you're saying to yourself, well, this is life. I got to stand here and I got to take wave after wave, and I can't fall down. But you can. There's a whole bunch of analogies I could do here, but sometimes you don't take the wave. Sometimes the wave takes you. And there's that moment when you're underneath the water and you're disoriented and you don't know where you are and you don't know which way is up, and that is a scary position, I understand, and you don't want to subject yourself to that. But sometimes you have to. I agree with that if you don't let the world break you, it will kill you. And that does bring the question, Hemingway himself, did he take his own advice? In this book, it's hard to say. In real life, it's even harder to say. We all know how it ended for him, which indicates perhaps a reluctancy to give way until he totally snapped. But I know he had a lot of other physical and mental ailments. The ending of this book, I cannot forgive Hemingway for. I would recommend anyone, if you haven't read this book, read it and stop 25 pages before the end, because it's an ending. It can wrap up, and I should have done that. I thought about doing it, but I didn't. And for me, in my current position in life, with my current aspirations in the next year or so, this was the exact worst ending of that could have possibly been. What happened at the end of this book? Maybe that's a complete spoiler to some, I don't know. But my God, man, come on. Just a glimmer of hope. I mean, a book can end in death and still be uplifting, I think. But the way that he did it here, he just piled it on, scoop after scoop of sadness. And it was rough. And I mean, sure, I got misty-eyed at the end of that one, but that's just because he brute forced it. It wasn't the finesse of Capote. It was just a shove into the void. Brutal stuff. And there was no bullfighting. No signature Hemingway bullfighting. There was alcohol throughout the entire book the guy was drinking. And also his wife, the nurse, while she was pregnant, drinks vermouth, I think it is, to keep the baby small. And those little bits of antiquity in these books really take me out of it. And it does add some kind of novelty, like you're looking at a history exhibit or something, which I do enjoy, but it really highlights how detached that part of history is from modern day. For better or for worse, I don't know. All right, lastly, I was going to read something more literary, although I guess this is literary, but I definitely needed something as positive as possible after the ending of A Farewell to Arms. Something light, something breezy, something uplifting, so eventually I decided upon New Hampshire by Robert Frost, which was a book of poetry that's been on my shelf for a while. I don't know much about Robert Frost beyond The Path Less Taken and the fact that he was a nature writer in New England, and I live in Connecticut, so I thought it would be relevant. And it was. It was a very good book, but very mixed. He starts off with these long-form poems, and I don't know if that's what you call them. I'm definitely out of my element here. I'm not a poetry person. He does go into more traditional poetry at the end of this book, or, you know, what I imagine to be traditional poetry. What do I know? But, you know, a poem that looks like this. And I will admit, again, this poem right here got me misty-eyed. And that's much shorter than the short story of Capote. So I guess more of a feat. I don't know. Don't worry, I'm not going to recite any poetry to you, but I am going to put this in the description. It is very popular, I think, because it was on the back of this book, but it's beautiful, especially for those of us in the Northern Hemisphere who need a little dose of spring right now, and those of us that need a reminder that winter exists so that spring can exist. It is a beautiful cyclical thing, this world. But this was very much a mixed bag. I got lost reading a lot of the longer poems, and I know I should probably read it more thoroughly or more carefully, but I feel like it's poetry and you have to get in the flow of it. And if you have to go back and reread, then like I'm doing something wrong or the poem's just not speaking to me. Some of them hit really hard, most of them not really. But it did its job. It was uplifting, it was light, it was breezy. I'm certainly not doing myself any favors reading poetry just after I've switched my reading goal to be word count, but that just goes to show you I'm not trying to game the system here. I liked it. And also, I had a comment a while ago saying that I looked like a young Robert Frost. I have not looked up those pictures, but I'm going to. And maybe I do, maybe I don't. I guess we'll see together. And those are the first 3 books I read this year, and the first 3 books of this new reading challenge. So we got to add up all the word counts. I'm going to put them on the screen here. The poetry one is probably going to be an approximation because I'm not going to get something online. There we go. The first 100,000 or so words, the first few drops in the bucket of what's going to be a long and amazing reading year, just like last year. That's what I got for you. Thanks everyone for watching. Subscribe if you haven't, and I will see you next time. Bye-bye.